I would like now to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jensen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Shirley Hung, partner, is a member of the Business Process Services team. She advises senior stakeholders of global services, including enterprises, service providers, and investors in their strategic mandates and initiatives. Amy Fong, Vice President, is a member of Everest Group Sourcing and Vendor Management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in outsourced services categories. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Today we have an interesting topic. We're going to delve down into the world of procurement outsourcing. And when we were doing the prep session, I was talking to Amy and Shirley, and it's been interesting to see. This is one of the segments that really didn't see a dip last year when we entered COVID, like we saw in many of the different areas. But this is one that's continuing its steady state growth. And so today we're joined by two different perspectives on this marketplace. So Shirley spends her days talking to the enterprise and evaluating the different, talking to service providers and evaluating the different participants in the marketplace. And Amy spends her days and weeks talking to enterprises and understanding their demands and how they see the marketplace from the buy side. So if you think about it, you're going to get a full 360-degree view of the marketplace, and we'll bring that to you all in one place today. So with that, Amy, why don't you start us off with a view of what you think procurement leaders are thinking about in 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's great to have everyone here today. And whether you are outsourcing procurement or not, I tend to think that this is a topic you can learn a lot from. The highest performers in terms of capabilities, of procurement capabilities I've ever seen are those that are selling their services. So let's start out with where we are in terms of procurement leaders and CPOs and what really we're worried about and focused on in 2021. 2020 was a tough year for procurement, a lot of focus on risk, and that's carried over quite a bit. In 2021, what we're in the middle of right now is an acute shortage of talent and a lot of different acute shortages of supply. And I think anyone who buys things or hires people has seen that, down to, now I'm seeing headlines on toy shortages at Christmas time. So that's really driving the attention of procurement, the supply chain bottlenecks for a lot of critical goods, as well as the challenge in acquiring talent for services. We also have that increased focus on supply risk management. We've been talking risk management for a decade now, but all of a sudden last year, everyone realized that, wow, our business really relies on our supply base and we can't function without our suppliers. And we need to pay attention to a lot of different risks out in the market and internally. There's also this need to either catch up or jumpstart on digital transformation for most procurement organizations. Most leaders had a vision of getting to, an automated digital process, at least for the transactional activities, focusing our effort on high value stakeholder and supplier centric activities. There's a lot of reasons that technology has been harder to adapt, harder to implement and roll out and get to full coverage. And so there's a catch-up process right now that we're all focusing as well on. And I think that as we talk about this today, we'll see how, sometimes using third parties for outsourcing can help with that and help to kind of leapfrog some of those steps. There's also some pressure to up their game on corporate social responsibility. So this is, whether you're outsourcing or not, if you're in a procurement organization, I would guess that 3 out of 5, if not all 5 of these are on your radar right now. And we'll talk a little bit more today about how procurement outsourced service providers are, sharing expertise, are helping to streamline those processes, and are addressing some of these really core issues.
So Amy, let's go back to that first topic about talent and talent shortages. This industry is based on a lot of the ability to get people, whether it's for procurement or for any of the other organizational needs of the enterprise. I was talking to a major staffing services executive, and he said he was having an incredibly tough time just hiring recruiters that could hire recruiters that could hire staff in there. How bad is it out there in this whole talent war, talent shortage?
Yeah, so Michael likes to look at a lot of the JOLTS reports and the data in the market, and I think across the board the trend is that it's an employee's market, and we've had quite a U-turn in the market for hiring recently. When we get down into the nuances and the nooks and crannies, we see a lot of challenges with our service providers in areas like IT. Historically, though, procurement has had a challenge before the crisis even of hiring category managers and supplier managers and really a lot of those strategic roles. If you live somewhere like I do in the Bay Area and you have category management experience or contracting experience in, say, fintech or in these startups, you are a rock star and can probably write your own ticket. I have a lot of friends who've done that and have gone the IPO to IPO to help them with their contracting. It was hard to find category managers. Now, when things are taking off in terms of, demand and digital transformation, even harder. So I actually think that talent supplementing and accessing experienced category managers is one of the things that, one of the holes that procurement outsourcing can potentially plug, depending on how you configure the model.
Okay. Let's do this. Let's get some input from the participants in the webinar, and let's get some ideas of what you're thinking about in terms of what activities do your procurement outsourcing service providers support you today. So which of these processes are you currently getting outsourced? And we're going to open up the poll and encourage you to select those that apply to your organization. And if you go ahead and input your answers now. Let's get some feedback here, and we'll start that with an overall context of what this audience is seeing.
This is always really interesting to me. This is the kind of data I want to dive into and see how many people select, 3 or more of these and how many select just one little piece. So many different flavors of outsourcing procurement.
Okay, all right, well, we'll give it another 3 seconds here. Looks like there is 3 categories here that are actually almost tied for first. And so let's go ahead and close the poll and let's open it up here. So Amy, I'm seeing really 3 leaders here. I'm seeing the digital transformation, process improvement. I'm seeing the tactical sourcing buy desk, and I'm seeing the category management sourcing execution is the top 3 on this list.
Yeah, very interesting. If we were to ask this 10 or maybe even 5 years ago, I think it would almost all, most people would be using outsourcers for transactional activities, kind of the buy desk, buyer, rec to PO process, P2P stuff, what we consider downstream. To see that many of you, 45% with category management or sourcing and 53% with digital transformation is really interesting. It tells me that we are, this audience is starting to use PO providers to do the more strategic work where they may not, have the skills or enough resources or just the experience. So that's an interesting, great vote of confidence, I think, and transition for the market.
What also is, I think, telling of some of the things that have happened in the industry was some great technology that can be brought to bear here, but the resources to looking to outside resources to make that happen appears to be that is the #1 answer here.
Yeah. Really interesting.
All right, so let's move into the content we've got prepared for you. We're going to talk about the anatomy of a high-value procurement outsourcing model. We're going to talk about the service providers and give you some perspective on what we see there, and then we have some case studies where we can drop into some detail of what they're doing, your peers are doing out in the industry. So, with that, Amy, talk to us about those strategic reasons for doing the procurement outsourcing.
Yeah, so I hit on a couple of these, but I just want to emphasize, why do people, outsource, and what are the strategic results you can drive from procurement outsourcing, and how are these increasing in the future? So we have a bit of a scale here. And this actually matches the whole pretty nicely, and that accelerating digital transformation was number one. And that's really what we see as the top, in the future, the top change we expect through procurement transformation or procurement outsourcing. Also, increasing more strategic intent of the services is a key lever here, or key path to drive more strategic results. Looking at domain expertise and accessing domain expertise, as well as flex working models. We have, I think of that as, having a lot of different tools in the toolbox that you can use depending on the challenge you're faced with from your stakeholders, your budget holders. Also looking at real-time and transparent governance, and we'll talk a bit about change management and how important that is in this process. And then one of the other key ways that you drive results is by aligning your pricing structures with performance. And we're going to hit on that as well. We'll touch on all these today, not necessarily in this order. We may jump around a little, but this is a great guidebook to, the things that you should be thinking about if you want to get more out of a procurement outsourcing relationship. And so Shirley, tell us a little bit more about the maturity levels that you see in procurement outsourcing.
Thanks, Amy. We've observed a typical maturity curve that many organizations go through when they embark on their outsourcing journeys. As organizations increase in their outsourcing maturity from left to right on this visual here, they derive more strategic value from their relationships. And this holds true as well for outsourcing of procurement. The first activities that are typically outsourced, as Amy mentioned earlier, are the transactional work, which includes rec-to-PO management, contract creation, administration, compliance monitoring, e-catalog management, and compliance tracking. But as organizations become more comfortable with leveraging third parties to perform procurement processes, they tend to explore partnering with their service providers in more tactical areas such as sourcing, spot buying, tail spend management, and supplier performance management. But the organizations that are truly driving the most value from their outsourcing engagements are also partnering with their service providers in more strategic areas, such as category strategy development, supplier development, supplier innovation, and supplier and risk compliance management. It's really important to note that the penetration of outsourcing for procurement is still relatively low as a function, especially in comparison with other more mature functional areas such as IT, finance, and HR. So best-in-class examples for most industry sectors are still in the outcome-driven, phase, where and most organizations tend to fall somewhere between lagging and operational. Although that being said, it does sound like from some of the process activities that our participants have outsourced, they may be a little bit more mature than some of their peers may be. So in short, speaking broadly for the function, there is ample opportunity for organizations to drive more value from their outsourcing model in procurement.
So Shirley, some of these things I've seen outsourced for decades, largely started out with value propositions around labor arbitrage along some of the transactionals. And we saw that kind of in Amy's comments in the quick poll that we did earlier. What's generating the buzz in 2021?
Well, according to data that we collected this summer, 3/4 of organizations expect to expand the scope of their procurement engagement with service providers in the next 12 to 18 months. And the expected average increase in procurement outsourcing spend is just over 9%. So these companies are planning to expand the spread of services into more strategic engagements, such as category and sourcing expertise, which is really understandable considering the talent shortage challenges that you mentioned earlier, and that's occurring across most geographies. In addition, there's a real buzz, as you say, around all things ESG. So many service providers are partnering with their clients to support them in delivering against their environmental, social, and governance objectives, whether that means, supplier diversity or sustainability monitoring and reporting.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that ESG toward the end of the webinar, so stay tuned for that.
Absolutely. So if we could flip to the previous slide, I think we may have accidentally skipped one. There we go. We are seeing a real focus, as mentioned earlier, on accelerating digital transformation and procurement. And if you have attended some of our previous webinars, we've discussed how procurement has traditionally lagged other functions in terms of digital adoption. Due to pandemic-induced disruptions, procurement now has this strong mandate to invest in digital transformation as businesses are expecting better outcomes, including operating model improvements, cost savings and cash flow improvements, process and technology optimization, and innovation enablement. We are seeing leading service providers develop and deploy new digital solutions to address their clients' challenges, such as supplier risk management, real-time monitoring of supplier performance, and driving additional savings through prescriptive spend analytics. From an organizational point of view, there are a few best practices to keep in mind when you're embarking on a digital transformation journey. The first one is around centers of excellence. But the majority of transformational initiatives are really governed by the COEs, with participation across all business units, as well as the C-suite. The role of the COE is centered around driving innovation, collaboration, and excellence to guide executives and drive transformational initiatives, such as process improvement. For procurement, digital plus domain is a key best practice, with organizations having, for example, an analytics COE that is leveraged in conjunction with category expertise in respective category management COEs. Sometimes these category management COEs can be provided as a service by procurement service providers to existing clients when they need domain expertise during sourcing negotiations, market intelligence support, and such type of activities. The second best practice is around design. Many transformation engagements involve leveraging design thinking principles and taking a stakeholder-centric approach to achieve process optimization. And in response to this demand, leading service providers have made various acquisitions in this space so that they can leverage their design thinking frameworks to help design source to pay transformation strategies for their clients. And finally, in order to create this factory to standardize processes, improve compliance, and drive value, organizations need to have access to resources with industry expertise and consulting capabilities. And again, this is an area that outsourcing service providers are investing heavily. They're building up their consulting capabilities to support their clients to drive change through digital transformation.
So let's talk about one of the other aspects that we talked about, or that we mentioned earlier, which was really looking at the governance of procurement outsourcing engagements. And there's a lot of different activities that fit into governance that relates to procurement, finance, and business units. Things like continuous improvement and commercial and legal support, financial support, reviews, reporting, service delivery management, account relationship management, all fit into that bucket of governance. And there's a lot of ways to really optimize this area. I think the key things to think about are along the bottom here. So thinking about optimizing those governance charges. Governance fees can be really subjective. They're very dependent on the value the enterprise expects and feels they're being provided. Things like onshore requirements, geographic spread, language requirements, process controls, the complexities of your contract can drive those governance fees. In my days coaching, procurement and specifically P2P, we thought a lot about how do we become a customer of choice and treat our suppliers as customers. And this is a scenario where certainly being a customer of choice, or I guess an easier to work with customer, can drive those fees. The more complexity you have in your process and your governance model, the more complexity that's going to carry back to be covered at those fees. Self-service is one of the things that can enable a more streamlined design. So we're seeing more experience-led design that helps with real-time and transparent governance. Things like, for example, allowing procurement users to set up buying channels. That is a really big deal that streamlines the process and takes less oversight from the PO provider. Standardizing your SOPs, your process handoffs, policies, management procedures, resource allocations, as well as kind of the outside controls and the processes to review. That's best practice. The more standardized you are, the less noise there is in the system for the outsourced partner. And then finally, the last thing is really seeing in successful projects is change management being integrated in. It is not a separate operational team or item. It's part of the transformation. And change management is really viewed more as an ongoing process, I think, in a lot of environments these days. So, really thinking about how you can streamline the environment to the point that that governance charge is less impactful and the governance model is more beneficial really for both parties, both buy side and sell side.
So Amy, let me ask you a question here. We just went through a pretty traumatic experience in our world economy and our world of business, if you will. How did we do with the pandemic in some of these procurement outsourcing deals?
Good question. I think that overall we've seen a lot of the procurement outsourcing increase. The procurement was in a role in the last 18 months where they really needed all hands on deck to help with assurance of supply, to mitigate the risks of providers. And the more resources you had in terms of working with the outsourced partners, having a PO provider, a service provider that could add to the internal team, I think the better you survived, right? It was a resource shortage climate for 18 plus months now, and for most procurement teams.
Yeah, and I think
worrying about sourcing things they had never sourced before.
Yeah, and when you and I talked about some of the things, hey, we get to go back to the basics of just securing supply, but I think overall the feedback that you and I got was actually very positive. I mean, there was an all hands on board type mentality. We need to get the job done, not go back to the contract, but go back to what's the right thing for the business. And both partners really stepped up in most cases. I heard some exceptions, but mostly it was pretty good success. But I also think that also led us to the conversation around, hey, we realize that we do need to invest in the technology, which leads us back to those quick fall results and some of the conversation around the digital transformation, saying, hey, we really needed to step up that aspect as well. So, so I think good news.
Yeah, certainly. It's been, I think when you look back at where procurement was in March of last year, right? You had organizations that all of a sudden we need to buy thermometers and masks and PPE that we never had to buy before. And, having a third party, a category manager at a PO, provider that is going through that for 20 other companies at the same time, there is some advantage to that, right? You're able to hire in that expertise or leverage that expertise. Now, a year later, it's not necessarily, we're still buying masks, but the challenges are, hey, what's going on with the prices of steel and, all the other commodity prices and shortages that are out there. So I would say it's the more hands, the better, the more heads, the better.
Yeah.
On some of these issues.
I think there's a long tail for the pandemic in the procurement world here that's not related to the mask or the hand sanitizers. It's related to all the disruptions. So, all right, fantastic.
So Shirley, you've been more exposed to the talent side of this. Could you talk a little bit about kind of how we future-proof the talent model? I mentioned that as one of the challenges for CPOs right now.
Yeah, in order to drive more strategic outcomes from procurement outsourcing, as you guys have just actually alluded to, organizations are really focusing on increasing domain expertise. And also embedding flexible working models with their service provider partners. And from a skill gap perspective, the need for digital data analytics and innovation capabilities, all of that is pretty well understood. However, it's also important to make note that there's a significant talent gap in more softer skills, interpersonal skills, such as conflict management, emotional intelligence, business partnering, relationship management, and collaboration skills. And service providers really can be a really good source of talent if an organization is finding difficulty attracting and retaining required skill sets at the time that it's needed. So best practices that leading service providers are investing in include setting up, dedicated COE-led training grids to continuously upgrade their employees' domain and digital skills. They're also establishing advisory groups that comprise of senior practice leaders and subject matter experts to facilitate knowledge transfer by sharing collective learnings, insights, and innovative thinking with both internal and external stakeholders. Also, in today's working environment, we cannot avoid mentioning work from home, right? Best-in-class organizations are treating differentiated work environments, non-monetary awards, and employer branding as key levers to attract and retain talent in an organization. We're also seeing agile talent management to be on the rise, which means bringing in the right resources at the right time. Again, this is a well-known key benefit to leveraging an outsourcing model.
So let's talk a little bit about the pricing, because I think that's the other important piece of this, and probably an area that we've seen go back and forth in various outsourcing categories. Michael's got a long history in the outsourcing industry and have seen all of these models kind of come into fashion at various times. We are seeing more and more pricing structures that are linked to performance, but most common is a hybrid structure right now. If you look at this data on the left, you see not as much output-based and outcome-based as a pure play, about a quarter with input-based, but really the majority having some combination of these. And that makes a lot of sense to me. They're kind of pros and cons to each of these models. So let me just walk through them quickly. In an input-based model, you see this a lot on, kind of the tradition, I guess it's not traditional, but, on the sourcing side, right? There's a little bit less incentive for providers to push the envelope beyond going, headcount linked, beyond just basic headcount linked growth, putting more bodies on it. But it does make sense when there's a high degree of certainty on resource requirements. You don't necessarily have the same ownership level on your suppliers across the value chain, to really optimize or really innovate. You're just paying per head. That's common, I think, when you have, just portions of the process outsourced. Maybe I need 2 sourcing execution managers or 2 category managers here, or a couple people to work on this project. Output-based, makes a lot of sense when you're looking at extreme demand swings, when you have, when you can really clearly measure the output of a process. We see that with like the P2P process, invoice-based, per employee based on the payroll side, all of these kind of per per volume type measurements. It can lead to quality risks when you have high demand and efficiency risks when you have low demand, right? It's a little higher risk for the suppliers, and buyers just don't have as much control in utilizing resources as well. Outcome-based, that sounds great in theory. And it does make sense when you want to enable risk sharing, especially for digital transformation. Outcomes in sourcing and purchasing can be very hard to measure, though. And it can get very complicated in an outcome-based arrangement when you're looking at resource loading and costing and pricing and building in risk premiums, especially given the risks of actually reaching the outcomes in some of these more complicated procurement engagements. So you don't have as much, insight then into the actual costs. There's a lot more variability into your costs. Hybrid is really, kind of does help the customers to optimize the budgets and not necessarily compromise quality. So, you do need the supplier to still be focused on managing the end-to-end service delivery. And buyers do want to have some control of resource allocation. So, I think of this as there are certain parts of the source to pay process that might be more, appropriate for certain parts, certain types of pricing. We can do invoice based on, the AP process, and maybe on POs where we're looking at orders. Outcome based on, maybe some of the categories that are 100% managed by a service provider. But others that might be more, other categories that might be more combined effort, and ultimately the company, the buy side has the responsibility for the actual savings realization. Maybe an input-based pricing model is more appropriate. So, that's where we see these hybrid models, and it's not particularly surprising to me to see that combination.
So Amy, I'm a big, I did deals, as you well know, and pricing is a key mechanism of declaring value. So it's one thing to have a marketing brochure that says, hey, we're going to give you all these wonderful things. But if the invoice says, hey, I'm going to just charge you on per input, you got to get a disconnect between value proposition and what you show up on the monthly bill. But here's a good question for you, right straight from the audience here. It says, on pricing models assumed in new contracts, does it typically begin with either an outcome or input based and then shift to a hybrid? If so, what is the point of partnership? At what point in the partnership do we see shift to hybrid pricing? So is it starting out, I guess the net of that is it starting out hybrid, or is it evolving to hybrid?
Yeah, so I think that a big piece of this is very dependent, or a big factor is very dependent on what you're outsourcing and the provider you're working with, which I think Shirley's going to cover in a few minutes. There's a lot of different flavors of PO providers. If you are working with a provider that specializes in sourcing and you're handing over, a bunch of categories to them, I think you can start out in an outcome-based model. You're handing over the digital transformation, an outcome-based model may make sense. I think if you're handing over, or if you're giving them pieces and you're, using a bit of, closer to a staff aug type model to build out your team, and they're doing the PO, rec to PO work, you're probably going to need more of an input or an output based model in the near term. As you start to combine those activities, that's where you start to see those hybrid relationships. So, are you starting out with a big bang of take over all of procurement? Then you're probably going to see a standard model from the start. Are you starting with littler, bits of activities and kind of handing them off to the procurement provider, over the outsource provider over time? Then you're going to see more of that hybrid transition. I'll ask Shirley, have you, any thoughts on that? Have you seen different models like that?
I mean, I would tend to agree with you. I think, generally speaking, there are a lot of additional complexities associated with outcome-based pricing models, and not the least of which is actually the level of trust that you have between a buyer and their partner. And so generally speaking, that requires a bit of maturity in the relationship. And so maturity in the relationship as far as handing over control over those processes, but also which at that point you can actually dictate an outcome to the fees, but or associated and linked to the fees, but also kind of trust and maturity in being able to actually tweak the outcome-based model according to because you're not going to get it right the first time, frankly. And so you have to trust that your provider is going to be wanting to work towards the same outcome that you have as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've mentioned before, I spent a lot of time researching value measurement and value capture from procurement teams, and that alone is really challenging internally, right? Often, even in my old days in consulting, or even now in some of the projects that we work on, people will come in and want us to do a deal where, do a project where, a sourcing project where the savings are split, right? Or there's savings-based compensation, right? Those can be very contentious in the sense that if you don't have trust, the better you do, the more the client pays for the project, right? Clients don't always want that. They want you to be successful and save as much as possible. They don't necessarily want to pay more for the service if there's more success, right? And it's very hard to define baseline. It's hard to define, it's one thing to say we negotiated this much savings. Actually validating that the savings were achieved is a whole other animal. And, you're, to Shirley's point, you need a mature relationship, and you also need a certain culture in the buying side company and in the outsource provider to be able to make some of these outcome-based arrangements work.
Ultimately, it comes down to who's making the investment, who has the control, and then who's taking the risk. So anyway, all right, so let's move on here to the an opportunity to actually spend more time with Amy and Shirley in one of the we have what we call our price check. If you're interested in getting a bit of a slice of our databases, these two can help you with that. We have on the screen there an opportunity to get a set of rates from one of these functions as well as 3 of these countries. And so this is an opportunity to dive into our databases. We do know that what we've seen talking to clients here, this is a very dynamic area right now. We are actually starting to forecast rate increases and starting to see that in the industry. So if you're interested in the latest up-to-date information, go ahead and I think there's a link in the there's a link in the chat.
Link in the chat as well.
Yeah. So if you're interested in that, take advantage of that, please. Okay, so now we're going to move into our final section here, and really going to move into the service provider. And Shirley, you're going to you spend time evaluating and going through all the value propositions and all the capabilities, and you do client reference checks, and you're really kind of get a qualitative and a quantitative view of the marketplace. Tell us what you found.
Yeah. So recently we released our updated procurement outsourcing services peak matrix assessment report. And that featured a mix of broad-based and niche service providers. We, as you mentioned, Michael, we assess these organizations leveraging our peak matrix framework according to their market impact along the y-axis and their vision and capability along the x-axis. There's some really interesting service providers featured in this year's report, including Dragon Sourcing, which is focused on global sourcing of goods in a specialized direct spend categories. Chain IQ, which is a specialist provider focused on high value strategic activities such as category management and strategic sourcing for indirect spend. So there's lots of different service providers that could be suitable, for different organizational needs. In this assessment, we captured their 2020 performance, which we all know was an extremely unique year. Overall, it was really gratifying to hear that procurement service providers were successful in helping their clients maintain business continuity and overcome challenges associated with COVID-19 related disruptions. You asked the question earlier around satisfaction, and we saw some very high satisfaction scores across the board, with an average of a 4.6 out of 5 in terms of clients appreciating the support their service providers gave them during this period of time.
No, that's absolutely amazing, and I think we see that in many different sectors of the outsourcing. So it's good to see here specifically for procurement outsourcing. Shirley, I counted almost 20 different dots or stars or different service providers on this list. We're not saying that the best ones are all up in the upper right. We actually take a more nuanced approach that says, hey, you should look at a lot of different places on this chart.
That's right, absolutely. Our framework is really meant to give a high-level summary of a provider's overall capabilities and market impact, but the right partner is very dependent on your organizational specific requirements, and it may mean that the best fit is with a service provider that's outside of that upper right quadrant. Some providers, they offer niche and specialized capabilities, such as the couple that I mentioned earlier. But there are others as well. And in fact, actually, we have a page in our report that calls out some of the unique capabilities for a subset of these service providers. And they could fit exactly with what your organization needs. Our research features these 20 somewhat providers precisely because they can all add client value in some sense. So, what we're seeing is actually a delineation in categories of service providers in the next slide across different types that according to their focus in the source to pay value chain and their overall services capabilities. There are broad-based providers such as Accenture and Genpact, where they provide outsourcing services across multiple business processes. And for these providers that have both IT and BPS capabilities, they can club the implementation and maintenance of IT services along with source to pay processes. So typical offerings for these providers might include multi-tower coverage, including end-to-end procurement transformation, consulting-led execution services, and integrated solutions across business functions. There are also, specialists such as GEP and Corbis, which focus on providing outsourcing services in the procurement domain primarily. And most of these players are source to contract focused, with expertise around strategic sourcing, spend analytics, spend management, and supplier management. So the landscape is really ever evolving. From a market share point of view, the top 3 procurement outsourcing service providers are Accenture, GEP, and IBM. Together, they account for more than 50% of the market share. But however, as I mentioned before, procurement outsourcing has a relatively low penetration and a very high growth potential. And in 2020, we saw that the market grew by 8 to 10%, and we project that this growth will be sustained. So as analysts, we will be closely following this market, and I expect that to see both new entrants and changing market shares as the procurement outsourcing market evolves. We encourage you to look for our latest PEAK Matrix report to get more information about the procurement outsourcing service provider landscape. And it does include details on the capabilities of each service provider. So you'll be able to find that on our report portal.
All right, great. Let's do another quick poll here. Let's get some input from the audience. And So while we're presenting a pretty rosy picture of the industry here, we want to hear some of the challenges that you're facing from your existing engagements with your procurement outsourcing providers. So tell us some of the things that are not working so well, some of the challenges you're faced. And
most of the people in this call seem to be outsourcing something, so I'm sure everyone has a challenge, right?
This is your time to put it on the table here. All right, we're going to leave it open for another 10 seconds here. 5, 4, 3. Okay, we're still getting a lot of answers here. We'll go ahead and close it. All right, let's close it out now, Kira. All right, so the number one challenge here was reactive approach to improvement, identification, and solution. So this is the, hey, we want to look forward here and look ahead and find out those things that would be most helpful to improve things here. I think the next one is lack of innovation. It's kind of related to that.
Yeah. This surely this matches our day jobs, doesn't it? Right? We definitely hear from companies that are like, my PO provider is doing what we pay them to do, but they're not doing anything extra. And I like to quote our CEO, who says innovation is not free, because there's a whole art and science to how you drive more proactive innovation and process improvement and in outsource engagements. More than we can cover here, but common challenge.
Yeah, that's what I go back to.
Right.
I go back to that statement, you pay for what you get here. And I think if I want to put a historical perspective, going back into my history, lack of innovation is the number one challenge, going back to the history of all the deals that I've seen in customer feedback. All right, let's move on to a couple case studies here. Shirley, you're going to talk to us one about a Fortune 100 healthcare company.
Yeah, we've heard from many of our clients that they're interested in hearing about how their peers tackle similar challenges to the ones that they face. In this webinar, we've really been focusing on how organizations can drive strategic value from their procurement outsourcing relationships. So we did want to include 2 examples of companies that precisely did this, leverage their third parties strategically to achieve better outcomes. I'm not going to actually, read through this in detail. Certainly, you'll be able to access a playback of this webinar and the slides from our site, so you could read through this at your own leisure. But this first example comes from the healthcare industry, and I think many of you will identify with the challenges that we note on the left-hand side around having a decentralized procurement function and all of the inefficiencies and inconsistencies that go with that. And so they really did drive an end-to-end kind of functional transformation by leveraging outsourcing and achieve some really great outcomes from doing so. The next example is one that comes from the UK financial services industry, and they were really wanting to develop a digital procurement strategy to better manage risk while bringing supplier relationship management and procurement functions under a common leadership. As well as, of course, achieving higher cost savings through increased spend visibility. So they kind of wanted all of that that digital transformation can provide. In their engagement, they leveraged the consulting capabilities of their procurement service provider to digitally transform their source to pay process. And again, achieve some really amazing results. They were able to take their spend visibility from 30% to 77% through the span of the engagement. They were able to achieve increased annualized savings by nearly 8 times over 4 years. Lots of examples such as these that we've collected in our research over the years. And if you have kind of wanted to discuss any of these types of benefits and challenges that can be achieved through outsourcing, please do feel free to reach out to us at any time. So going forward, Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about how we see procurement outsourcing evolve?
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about some of the areas that we see procurement outsourcers starting to come in and help more on. And I see a question, and I want to kind of throw it in on this slide about how we see the convergence of procurement outsourcing and MSPs, particularly moving up the value chain, particularly in the space of services spend management. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know that we've seen much overlap yet. We do a peek on MSPs, we do a peek on PO and SCM, supply chain management, and I don't think that we've necessarily seen the same providers really overlapping. I do think that the PO providers have gotten pretty active on, trying to manage services, but not necessarily trying to manage the staffing firms the way the MSPs do. So I'm not quite sure that the overlap or the convergence is there yet, but I think that's a really interesting trend to point out. The person that mentioned that there could be some overlap as those categories kind of converge and the tools we use, converge as well. I think when we go back to some of the priorities in the market, sustainability is a big one. Diversity and sustainability, we've been working on those for a long time, but they're top of mind now. They've moved out from procurement projects to board level issues. Risk management, again, got a lot of light shined on risk management in the last year and a half. And we'll continue to see, just the level of data that is needed for really effective risk management, as well as building risk mitigation strategies. I think that's a great area for PO providers to expand into, because it's very hard to cover all of that internally. And then co-innovation. So innovation being both, supplier-led innovation as well as process improvement. I think of innovation as product and process improvement that can be driven by suppliers or can be driven by your PO providers as well. Are probably the three areas that we expect the most change in the near term.
So Amy, we just brought on a principal analyst for impact sourcing sustainability research. So it's a new role that we introduced to the firm here. I know you two have been talking, and I've been talking to her, and you and I have been talking. So what are the conversations that she brings up, and then what are you thinking, how are you two intersecting?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I have been in the space of diversity and sustainability, supplier diversity for a long time, but the categories that procurement is focused on have very typically been, for sustainability, materials, packaging, things like that. For supplier diversity, certain categories were a little bit easier to find diverse suppliers by US standards, at least. So staffing firms, promotional items, US standards were diversity owned companies. A lot of what we're talking about now is how do we help procurement organizations expand those initiatives into their services categories. And at the same time, we're seeing the service providers try to offer more in terms of that. So it's not just supplier ownership diversity, it's what is the workforce diversity of the supplier. We're not great at measuring that right now. And what kind of RFP questions should we be asking in a services engagement for an IT supplier to make sure that their IT services are green? So there's really a huge opportunity there to expand what procurement is doing in the sustainability CSR ESG space.
Yeah, I was talking to one client, and they were asking me about, what's the LBGT plus strategy for locations around the world, and I'm thinking that was the first time I'd heard that in such definitive terms. I won't mention the company's name, but they were making that almost higher than they were, cost takeout or cost reduction. So, all right.
And matching values, you want your suppliers' values to match your company values, and that is becoming a big deal, for a lot of companies.
Yeah. All right, so Amy, we're going to do the Q&A here. We've been taking some of the questions along the way. We'll do a few more in a moment here. But Amy, you are talking to your clients. You have a couple offerings. In 60 seconds, how do you intersect with the clients? In terms
Yeah, I think that often procurement people don't realize that Everest Group offers a lot to category managers, sourcing managers, vendor supplier managers. We have both analyst access as well as published research. It's a very interactive, both market intelligence as well as price benchmarking and performance SLA benchmarking around outsourced providers across all categories, services, all IT services, BPO, engineering services, GBS and IT are other big stakeholders that we serve, as well as a lot of projects. So that's kind of my day job, and it's a lot of fun helping. We help sourcing category managers help their stakeholders make better decisions, and that's a lot of fun.
All right, thank you. All right, let's take at least one of the questions here. If you got others, continue to type those into the question and answer panel. All right, so the question here is, how does the current view of pricing structures compare with pre-COVID days? How do you envision this to develop over the next 2 to 3 years? So I think I'll hit a broad strokes, Amy, and then you can fill in some of the more specifics. I think in general, when we saw a slowdown last year across the outsourcing space, we saw rates come down, not necessarily on a rate basis, but we saw discounts being applied or at the invoice level. But we're seeing that reverse in the first half or the second half of this year, as we talked about that U-turn, Amy. Rates are actually starting to go up, and we just put out a quick poll yesterday on this very topic, and I looked at the answers this morning, and they're definitely going up. But give us your perspective on some of the nuances there.
Yeah, I mean, I think given the talent shortage that we're in and the demand for employees, especially skilled with experience, I think we're going to continue to see the cost go up for whether it's internal or external hiring. We've talked about it's an employee market. I think when we look at pricing structures, that is going to drive that. So if you are in a model where it's outcome based and your provider's not really getting much variation in terms of the cost of their employees, expect them to be coming back to you with, we need to reset based on the market right now. We're seeing a lot of that. I know Michael's got a quick pull out right now on, service provider cost increases or asks for cost increases at least. And we're helping people kind of understand, well, how much of that wage increase really should change the cost of the actual outsourcing agreement. All of you who've ever done a TCO model know that talent price or labor price does not equal total all-in cost. So interesting times.
So
yeah, so
I do want to. Can I just add one more comment about the pricing structures? I think one thing that we have seen from COVID is a increased appetite for shared risk and shared accountability and flexible pricing models, and they want their providers to absorb some of the fluctuations that we see. And so we do think that there's going to be more of a move towards shared risk type of pricing models within procurement going forward.
Yeah, and when I was doing that sneak peek on those answers there, roughly 3/4 of the respondents were saying that there was some kind of discussion, whether they're just starting it or have already completed discussions on rate increases. So there's a lot more activity going to happen here, guys, over the next few months here, probably a few quarters. We'll have to see where that takes us, but stay tuned, and we'll have the actual results here in the next week or so. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap here. And if you were interested in more in the blog or more content, there's lots on our website. And if you want to follow up with either myself or Shirley or Amy, feel free to drop us a line, either LinkedIn or our email addresses. And with that, we want to thank you for your time today. And Amy is our expert on all things procurement for enterprises, and Shirley on our expert on all things on this procurement outsourcing market and suppliers. It has been fantastic to talk to both of you guys together in this one forum. So thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot. Great talking with both of you. Thanks everyone for attending.